Bill Martin, director of the Valentine, leads the oldest museum in Richmond and the only museum dedicated to collecting, preserving, and interpreting the city's diverse history. For 30 years, Martin has expanded the Valentine's programming, grown Richmond walking and group tours, and worked collaboratively in the community to support city tourism initiatives and promote the social, cultural, and educational importance of the 1.6 million objects in the Valentine's collection. Martin also holds his Bachelor's of Arts in Urban Studies and a Master's of Arts in Public Administration from Virginia Tech. Hey, Bill. Thanks for coming and talking with us today for our Lunch and Learn.
I guess we're doing it.
I guess we're here.
We're doing it. Good.
I have a question for you, as well as a question for anyone else here who wants to share. I'm wondering, to kick us off as a little icebreaker, what your favorite Richmond dish is from restaurants past or present. And I'm going to put mine in the chat.
Okay, so everybody has to put this. This is an important exercise in the chat. So I have this really odd memory. No one on this chat will remember Morton's Tea Room. No one. Morton's Tea Room is located across the street from the Y. Downtown, there's an old house on the corner. And it was a really kind of an interesting place because in the years after the Civil War, women who didn't have really means to support themselves opened up tea rooms. The women's exchanged a variety of businesses to support their families, and Morton's Tea Room was one of them. And they had the best rolls. So I can still smell and taste the roll from Mrs. Morton's Tea Room, probably closed 25, 30 years ago, but was a regular spot at lunch for lots of folks. Let's go for obscure. There's got to be some other weird ones.
So specifically the rolls.
Just a roll. A good yeasty roll is hard to do.
I wish I had that to go with my sad steak right now. Steak. Well, anybody else feel free to pop yours in the chat once you think of it. But Bill, thank you so much for taking time out for us today. To start off, I was hoping you would just share a little bit about the Valentine. I know you all are just, if you haven't already celebrated it, are going to celebrate your 125th anniversary of the Valentine Museum. So if you could share a little bit about the Valentine's role in the community and its journey. I know that's quite the task in just a few moments, but yeah.
I think that the Valentine's interesting, by being here 30 years, but understanding the entire history of this place and the important role for the last 125 years that the institution has played and how it has changed over time. And I think that that's the lesson as I look through our history, certainly that very early years, the Valentines, artists and entrepreneurs early in Richmond's history. How we're founded, the kids, guess what? They send their kids to Europe during the Civil War. So our founders, some of the founding brothers, are in Europe from 1858 to 1865. They come back and they realize that if Richmond is going to be a place like these great European cities, that it needed to have a museum. And that without a museum, Richmond could not take its place among important urban places in the world. And so that's the origin of the Valentine. And they collected, and I'll just tell you, they collected randomly. World culture, European culture, American Indian material, you name it, they collected it and put it on display. Ultimately, the museum begins to shift in the 1920s. And this is a really important thing for all of us to think about how an institution, think about the 1920s in the United States and in Richmond, the rise of Jim Crow, the Great Depression is coming. There are all kinds of, there's anti-Semitism, lots of anti-immigrant sentiment. And the Valentine in the middle of all of this is schizophrenic in some ways because it becomes free for every Richmond public school student. So I can tell you that from 1902 through today, the Valentine has never charged a Richmond City School student, black or white. And that begins in this early part of the history of the institution. It's important to know that this dedication early on to public education, there's also this commitment to doing things differently. And so 1928, the Valentine hires really its first director. And, Laura Bragg. Anyone ever heard of Laura Bragg? She should be on everyone should know Laura Bragg, first woman to serve as a museum director in the country. And she comes to the Valentine in 1928 and really reorganizes the place, gets us in order, begins to establish the kind of professional standards that museums practice today. But she reorganizes the museum in really incredible ways. First time we have really formal galleries. And again, this commitment to public education. And you can see that sort of dedication to innovation, change in the collections and our kinds of programming. How do we do all that? But also realizing that the way we approach that history is different. Certainly the way the Valentine family looked at Richmond and looked at race and all the other issues that the community faces, it is clear from that early history that these are folks that were fundamentally involved in the creation of the myth of the lost cause. And so much of the programming that the Valentine did were really sort of a rationale for Richmond and the mythology of the city. And so moving beyond, you can see that the evolution, particularly in the 1950s and 60s and 70s and 80s, when the Valentine begins to do groundbreaking exhibitions that really dissect Richmond's history in very different ways. Early exhibitions on Richmond's Jewish history in the 1950s, women's history, workers' history, all of these important things that had not been studied and had been ignored by history. So many of those stories get added. And so that really sort of brings us to where we are today, where, we are looking at this broad range of Richmond history, acknowledging the institution's own role in creating that history and understanding where our role in making sure that we tell it in a more accurate way today. It's been 125 years. It was exhausting.
I remember you shared with me a little bit about the Valentine did a recent review of its collection, I believe. Can you talk? And you were just now talking a little bit about those early pieces that the Valentines were collecting. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I'm looking through to see how many collecting institutions we have in the conversation. But often what we find in large and small institutions, we so often, all of us, go, oh my gosh, that is a wonderful thing that a particular donor brings to us. And we accept it, even though we know that it really may not have that direct connection to our mission. But it might be connected to a gift. And so all of a sudden, after time, you end up with collections that may have objects that are not related to your mission. And that becomes an important opportunity to reevaluate. We also discovered in those early collecting a lot of Virginia Indian material. And so I'm happy to say that because of this review process, we have met all of our repatriation, are almost done with all of our repatriation of materials related to both Virginia tribes and tribes from across the tribal entities across the country. So that we are fully compliant with NAGPRA requirements, which are really important, I think, for all of us older institutions who have random things that end up on shelves. And so I'm happy to say today that we have reviewed all 1.6 million objects. We're not even sure that's how many we have. But I can say that we now have reviewed our collection and have really begun to see what is our mission. And how does this collection directly relate to who we are, who we want to be in the community? And that meant that there are numbers of things that were unrelated to us being Richmond, from around the Commonwealth, but also from places around the country. I'm happy to say that 50 museums around the country have received gifts from us of material that are not related to mission for our mission, but in other places have gone immediately out on exhibition because they're important to those communities. And so it's been the last 5 years, particularly, as we really focus on our mission. If our mission is to reflect this community, how does this collection do that? And we realized as part of this process that yes, we have an amazing collection. Do we have a collection that actually represents Richmond? We don't. And so we now know what is missing, what stories are missing, what neighborhood histories are missing. And because of this, we have reduced the size of the collection. So it's probably not 1.6 million. But on the positive side of that, suddenly we now have space in our brand new storage that we've built over the last 2 years. Now we have room in this really amazing new storage facility to grow. So there's capacity in our archives, there's capacity in our costume and textile collection, there's capacity for new storage across all collecting areas. So we can say to someone, we don't have your story. We don't have this particular community represented, and actively collect. And so that's one of the things I think you can say you have a mission, but particularly for collecting institutions, does your collection actually reflect your mission? And we took what is a really tough step, I think, and said, we need to do that. And through that process, identified gaps, I was able to make sure that institutions that needed our objects got them, but also meant that there are lots of museums around the country that have great objects. And we know where everything is now. It's great.
Well, now that you've, identified these areas where you want to fill out your collection a little bit more, and you've done this review, you've passed on objects that are no longer serving your mission, how is the Valentine going about making selection for new objects to enter into the collection? How are you filling those gaps that you've identified?
And the way that we've actually been doing it over the last few years, exhibitions that are specifically focused on new immigrant communities. So we worked with Sacred Heart Center recently in the last 5 years or so for an exhibition collecting from new immigrant communities. We've got a new exhibition that's opening on the Asian American community in the spring. So begin by building an exhibition schedule that encourages these greater collaborations in the community. Not only is there an exhibition, but one of the side benefits is that we also are able to collect objects from those communities. And so it's when you have the structure is using everything we do to build those relationships, whether it's exhibitions, special programming, going to special events, showing up at the Asian American Festival, showing up at places where we know we are not represented, where the collection is not represented. And so trying to find ways to be in community to make sure those communities feel like you're committed to them too. Because it's not about people coming to you always. It's about making that extra effort with a particular donor, a particular organization, to make sure that those connections are built over time and are sustained. And that is probably the biggest challenge. So how do you, once you've done the exhibition, once you've done the program, is how those relationships sustain.
I'm wondering, we're talking a little bit about collection past, collection present, this long history of the Valentine, and how specifically in the last few years you all have had to kind of um, evaluate Valentine's traditions and evaluate how to move forward, how to best serve Richmond. I'm wondering, Bill, how you as a leader are how do you navigate all these different changes that also come with a level of controversy too? I know that you all, specifically in 2020, when we saw a lot of monuments come down along Monument Avenue and other locations around Richmond, and now you all house the Jefferson Davis statue that I believe was sculpted by Edward Valentine. A lot of controversy.
In the
Yeah.
studio here, yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, so how are you navigating that controversy and perhaps any pushback or conversations surrounding that?
I think that the first step in this work is actually spending some time doing the personal work you need to do. And so, given my history, I grew up in Culpeper County. The textbook that I had provided happy images of enslaved folks in Virginia, and understanding that the work that I personally needed to do needed to inform the work that we did here, and that as a community, the Valentine could help all of us spend that moment of reflection, of going into the original sources, understanding what was told in our history, and obviously biased and wrong, and how do we use those sources in a way that creatively moves that conversation as an institution, as a community, but also personally. Because the personal work, I think, is at the core of, as directors of institutions, we have to acknowledge the work that we have to do on ourselves first. And so for the Valentine, yes, it was that was a moment, 2020. But I will tell you, and I think that suddenly everybody's like, oh my gosh, it was 2020. The Valentine's commitment to the conversation around the meanings of the work on Monument Avenue and the lost cause began long before 2020. And in fact, many will remember the killings in Charleston. And with that event, the Valentine Board agreed at that moment that this was not, that the statues, particularly work by Edward Valentine, were important, that we saw monuments and statues being removed across the country, and that maybe there was a process forward for Richmond that may have been different than other communities. And so for the Valentine, it meant that we did an exhibition for really the first survey of all the Confederate monuments in Richmond, actually not just Confederate monuments, but monuments in general. And so from that, we see some rich, and that's a whole different, the monument conversation is probably just a whole different conversation. But understanding that there are these unique clusters of monuments, and when monuments go up, often monuments are not related when monuments come up and when monuments go down, because we've taken monuments down before. When monuments come up and come down, they're not necessarily about the people and events that are being marked, but are really much more about what's happening in the world today. And so the ability to say, okay, what was really happening in the 19 teens and 20s when the statues were going up? Is it really about the Civil War, or is it about a myth that is created about the Civil War? When the World War I monument, the Caroline, goes up in Byrd Park, what is that about? Why is it the architecture that it is? Why is the first monument, the first George Washington, on Capitol Square? And it doesn't happen until really the end, when all those revolutionary heroes are beginning to pass out of the way. So I think that, again, I know I'm just not answering the question, but I really am, because I do think that all of that put the Valentine in a trajectory where we knew that it was our responsibility, because of our history, because Edward Valentine was a sculptor, because the history of this institution in creating some of this history that we taught in the community, that we had this unique um, responsibility to tell the story differently and more accurately. And that was something that we absolutely had really through the only opportunity to do. And so that's really why and we worked over a decade prior to 2020 in efforts to bring those discussions from exhibitions to exhibition related to the redesign of the street to a variety of other things. And what happened is a moment in history. And so no matter what we believe about what happens with the statues, that moment when that statue hit that street is a moment in Richmond history that had to be preserved. And so that's the moment where we worked, and it was particularly important because it was a work by our founder. So that's the moment that you can't deny, because if we're about documenting the important moments in the life of the city, that day will be certainly one of the most important as we look back over the history of their city, one of the moments that changed Richmond forever. There are a lot of museums around the country that would love to have Jefferson Davis, but it's our story, and he's not going anywhere because it's the essential story of Richmond. It's part of the objects, and it's not. I will say that the statue is not shown in isolation. It is part of a comprehensive exhibition that the Valentine has on the city's history. It is shown next to a dugout canoe. It's shown next to other key objects that tell that story. So yes, it was, it was tough. And, think about how the Valentine, thinking about the Valentine family, who are still involved here, and all the work that, I will just say that I've been here for 30, and I am the luckiest person in the world, because some of those founders are still around, their family, and they understand how important the work is, and that because of this place that bears their name, that we all share this really important responsibility to tell the truth, to dig into the original records. And so while it was interesting, it should not be a surprise. It was certainly not a surprise to our board and to our community of supporters that Jefferson Davis ended up here on exhibition.
Okay, I feel like that answers maybe a little bit your question, Scott, about how the board felt about some of these new directions for the museum.
Well, the thing is, it's actually not new direction. I think that this notion that all of a sudden 2020 hits and we did like this new direction. Well, that's just kind of crazy. Because look at the exhibitions that we've been doing over the last 20, 30 years. Actually, go back further. That's not new. It is a commitment to this broader, more diverse story, telling untold stories. And it really it is kind of interesting that suddenly because we have this one particular position, the entire commitment of the institution over its history, particularly its recent history, is sort of like, well, they're just discovering all of this. Well, that's not necessarily true. We have a tradition, and that's why I think this tradition of change. I'll tell one quick story. My favorite trustee is now in her 90s. Yes, and she's still on the board. Um, but I asked her one day because she came as a volunteer to the Valentine. She came to the Valentine in the 1950s, and young Jewish woman. And guess what? There were Richmond's organizations, cultural organizations, were not open to her. She came to the Valentine in 1956 and has been here ever since. Um, and I asked her why. Why did she stay? She came as a volunteer. And what she said is that, gosh, the place has changed. But the Valentine has always strived to do what is useful. A wonderful little word. What is the community? What can be useful today? And that means that you have to change because the community changes. Um, and that's really so important, right? It's not about you. It's not about these great collections. It's not about these amazing curators. It's about how can we take all of these amazing resources and be useful, whether it's in public schools, whether it's in the public, whether it's in political discussions, meaningful discussions about the future of the city, planning, healthcare, all these major issues that we can pull from our archives and from our research, because there are things to learn about every single one of our important issues today, whether it's education, political access, all of the things that are critical to our conversation today are things that can be found here, but we have to have the responsibility to making that useful.
Yeah.
And I don't know what that's going to look like in the future. That's what's going to be fun is, how we're going to be, what role does AI play? I don't know. But those are all kinds of questions that we need to be thinking about.
Yeah. You say it's not about you, and I think that's a great perspective to run on, especially when, your organization are preserving and speaking on the Richmond community and its history. Although some might say that the Valentine is very much, you are very much associated with the Valentine, and you are an adored figure of the Valentine. I saw recently you had the Valentine had posted that your 30th anniversary was this past week, and you had dozens of comments sharing their love, not just for you, but for what you've done for the organization over your time. I'm sure there are potentially people on the call wondering, you've been there 30 years, why? And what potentially, no one's trying to shoot you out, but what might be next? What do you see?
This is an unfair question. Um, so no, I think it's absolutely fair. I am ancient. I understand that and embrace it. I think that it's amazing what happens. People are very polite and wonderful when you get old. Um, and it also means that as you grow older and that you also, I think, for me, have a greater freedom to say and do some of the things that I think I may not have done 20 years ago. But I think because of the confidence of the community and the Valentine that I've been able to take to be able to do things that I may not have done 20 years ago. And there's still some things I think in our community that are unresolved issues that we need to deal with. And so, so why did I stay? Every day is an adventure here. And my job has changed every day. There are new discoveries in the collection. So it is so much fun now because as the collection is coming back on site and being moved into storage, there are paintings and documents that in 30 years you'd think I'd seen everything. I'd not. And so just discover some new object, some new story, um, is enough to keep you going. I think that the job has changed over time. And I think that, I can sort of segment out, there's the first 5 years, it was one thing, there's another five, where the focus really of the job is one, for the first few years here was survival for the organization. The Valentine was deeply in debt, and had a crisis of confidence both with itself and the community. And so that was that. Growing institutional capacity, dealing with building, maintaining our commitment to excellence in engagement with Richmond Public Schools, which changes all the time. It's again, and at the end of the day, it's actually the people that work here. The people that, put up with all of this, that are creative and flexible and understand that we do have to, create this thing every day. That this notion that the Valentine is this institution drives me nuts. Because we really should perceive ourselves as every day a startup. That we need to be in this place where we're asking ourselves, what do we need to do today? What do we need to do today? And so don't really think about 30. Like, I'm not sure, I don't even remember most of it. There might have been, there could have been many things in the early days. I don't remember. But I think that for today, it's like waking up and saying, how do we create this place in a fresh new way, every day? There was a retail business, one of our department stores downtown, had this great tradition. Is they would every night when the store closed, they went into every entrance from Broad Street and Gray Street, and they would redo the entrances, the displays at those entrances. Not the whole store, but just those entrances, because the philosophy was a new experience every day. And so I think that's what motivates me to say, because it's a new experience every day. And the people that are along this journey, our donors who, gosh, are so tolerant, and our board who's so supportive, and staff, who kind of are in this together to try to figure out how we can take this place with this complicated history, this town, the city with a complicated history, and make sure that all the new people that are coming here get a sense of why it's important and their place in making it better.
Man. Thank you. Thank you for sharing.
You asked.
I asked. I want to take a moment and again just invite any of the participants we have on today to either unmute and share any questions they might have for Bill, or pop a question in the chat. Don't mean to put anybody on the spot, but certainly want our conversation. I have my questions in my little Word doc over here, but certainly want our conversation to be shaped by who's in the room and what curiosities have come up from anything we've talked about today. So don't be shy. We got Bill Martin here. Come on. What do we need to do today? Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, come on, guys. I know too many people in this room.
Look, he's here. He's wearing a tie. Come on.
that know enough embarrassing things that they can ask. I would say that the people in this room are so important. I mean, I think when I think about why, I think that when we think about all of the organizations and museums and other groups that do this culture business, um, we often think about it, museums are sort of seen in one spot, and visual arts are seen in one place, and performing arts. And the fact of the matter is that we're doing the same work. It is sustaining and supporting the culture of a place. And so whether it's, that choir on a Sunday morning in a great church, or a great concert in the Carpenter Center, it's still the Carpenter Center for me, guys. All of those things are part of the fabric of what makes Richmond special. And we talk so much about all this others. I'm really gonna go off now and get in real trouble. But I think that we don't really assert the central role of that in this community. That we think about sports and we think about outdoor recreation, we think about all kinds of things. But what the thing, everybody's got a river, sorry, a lot of rivers. Everybody's got a ball field. Not everybody has a Capitol designed by Thomas Jefferson. Not every place has the VMFA, the first state-supported art museum in the country, and now one of the largest gallery museums in the world in terms of comprehensive history. I'm just thinking who else is, but I think when we are small galleries, no one has that unique combination of, no one has a Jackson Ward, for God's sake. No one has a Shako Bottom. No one has a Shako Bottom. And so the assets that we have that are uniquely ours are the ones that we need to elevate, because it distinguishes, why would someone come here rather than going someplace else? And it's the cultural assets that we have that distinguish us and ones that we need. And again, I'm on a soapbox at this point, sorry, but it's really essential for us, the folks in this call, to just understand how we have to assert the central role of the work that we do.
Absolutely. I see some questions that have popped up in the chat. Thanks, guys. Related to what you've just said, I'll start with Mary's question of what do you see as the biggest issues surrounding arts and culture in Richmond right now?
Oh, Mary. I'm gonna, there's something that I'm obsessed with right now, and that is the health of our cultural, the arts district and cultural district in downtown. I think broad grace is an essential. It was created. It's downtowns are the place where culture happens, and we find ourselves in a moment now where I think that the very life of the institutions that stand at the core of the city are challenged. I think we see the many offices have not filled back up with folks back in their offices. We see state offices that are moving from downtown to the counties and other places. So you've got people that are leaving downtown, you've got building, and I think we can see that there are numbers of demolitions of buildings across the city. And what is the replacement? Do we demolish? There was a planning director here that says you shouldn't demolish anything until you've got something better to replace it. And so I think that we are seeing active demolitions, we're seeing safety issues that are really key. How do you feel when you come out of a Virginia Rep performance? Are the streets clean? basic things. And so it's about restoring that sense of downtown is the place where you have to come to experience the culture of the region. And so that would be my number. I mean, that's the biggest. It's a huge one. It is, you know, it involves all the organizations in downtown for small retail, hotels, hospitality, art galleries, VCU, the city. It's a really more complicated. It is a very complicated thing. But the fact is that in the past, there have been efforts to make sure that downtown was the core of activity for the region. And if you ask someone in the county, and said, well, you know, what's the heart of the region? They would say downtown. The downtown is important to the region. And we need to make sure that that word is believed today.
Yeah. Suzanne, you have a question?
I do. And Bill already acknowledged there is no other Shockoe Bottom in the country, which is sadly true. And we even have some great scholarship to really provide some interest, some beautifully researched history of the slavery industry in Richmond, which actually is one of the reasons that Richmond became so affluent. A tidbit I learned from Bill Martin long ago. But so now we're looking at a memorialization of that dark time in Richmond. And I'm curious to know what Bill thinks about the plan that has been put forward.
You know, I think that it's remarkable because we now have a general working plan for the redevelopment of Shockoe Bottom. I think you have Shockoe Institute, which is developing sort of the gateway. It's the first step in what will be a much longer process, but something that will be on the ground that people can do in 2025. That's exciting. Because it means it builds on the 30-year efforts of folks in the Slave Trail Commission, Dolores McQuinn and Ben Campbell, and all these amazing people that have been at this work for so long. And it puts at least, a line in the sand that something is happening, and there's this continuing commitment. I think the creation of Memorial Park, which really will include the Barrow Ground and Lumpkins Jail, an important use of a property that's kind of problematic because it's in a floodplain. And so, how do you take the complexity of building memorialization in a really hard site? And then, to located perfect location for the new Slavery Museum. And so I think that the plans that are currently in place are this really nice blueprint. This work it takes a long time. So when people get saying frustrated, oh my gosh, it's been 30 years, it takes a long time for these projects of this significance. The African American Museum in DC was mentioned 50 years, over 50 years. Prior to it, actually, though, maybe 100. These things take long-term thinkers. And I worry about that piece of it, that we want immediate now without thinking about the longer term. What is the infrastructure that needs to be in place? Both physical infrastructure, but board leadership and financial infrastructure that will support these institutions will create them and support them and sustain them long term. And that takes a lot of time. And we're all, we become so impatient. And we move on to the next project. And so I think part of why I'm here 30 years is sometimes it takes a long time to move stuff. And, boards get frustrated because, oh, it's 3 years and everything's not done. Oh, you've been here 7 years, it's not been done. I think that partnership of understanding that big stuff takes long. And that level of patience, I think, is waning, and one is something that I would be interested to see what happens next.
We have a couple more questions that I hope to get through in our final several minutes here. Portia, you said you had a question.
There's Jeff has a question.
And Jeff too, I know. I wanted to hop on and get these people who wanted to hop on camera.
I think Jeff was before me, so Jeff can go first.
No, I'm doing Jeff first. The process is really strategic.
I have a faulty process. I apologize.
It is a, you think that there's some elaborate, I think one thing is, what are the events? What are the issues in the community that we have the collections to address? There are things in the community that we think would be important for the Valentine to build not only exhibitions but programming around. So our curatorial team really influenced by our strategic planning, which sets certain areas of focus for us, begin to look at potential topics. Are there important anniversaries in the works, which affect sometimes? And we have an exhibition that's coming in the spring. Sometimes we just need to have a little bit of fun. And and so there's a new exhibition in our costume and textile galleries that's going to be called Fancy. And it's looking at sort of fancy dress and costume. Because every once in a while, we just need to laugh and smile and enjoy something that's beautiful. And so, the exhibition schedule is a sort of really interesting work in progress. We traditionally, the board will see the exhibition schedule as part of our annual budgeting process. But the board is not actively involved in the actual curation, selection of exhibition topics. That's something that really is, that's what curators do. And that sort of balance between what the community's interests are, what our specialties of our curators are, is sort of this interesting thing. It's fun to watch. And we don't plan, many places plan pretty far out on exhibitions. We don't, much to the dismay of lots of folks, because you don't want to miss an opportunity, or an issue or an idea that needs to be addressed that we could do. For instance, the exhibition that we did, that was a survey of monuments. We did in 8 months following Charleston. It was not on anyone's schedule, but we knew that we had the resources and it needed to be done. So it's actually that sort of, being flexible enough to respond to community issues. So it's an art. It's not a science, and we also don't. We plan really far in advance, and then we plan short term so that we can have that kind of flexibility.
Yeah, great question from Jeff Wells, one of our CultureWorks board members. I'm getting a little lost in my own chat over here. We potentially have time for one more question before we need to wrap up. So I apologize for not getting to all of these, but I do feel like Mary's question would sum up our conversation today really nicely. And that would be, what do you see as your legacy or most important contribution to the Valentine?
You know, I think that when I'm gone, no one will miss me. But they'll know. No, really, I think that there will be a strong board that's going, gosh, that was nice. Let's find the next person to take us the next step. Gosh, isn't it great? He left us with enough money in the endowment. He didn't, you know, he left the financials better than when he got here. And you know, I think the legacy is creating an organization that's strong, that doesn't, you know, that, and these kinds of transitions in leadership are never easy, but to making sure that all the bits and pieces that will make the next person successful is really what's important to me.
A very humble way to answer that question. Thanks, Bill. This has been so lovely. And I feel like we mined through so many gems and so many conversation topics. And again, I do apologize for those of you I wasn't able to get your question answered. And now he's been chit-chatting. He hasn't had time to use cheeseburger. What a shame. Thanks, everyone. Bill, is there anything you want to plug before we wrap up? Anything people should come out and see? I know you recently opened up your Style Weekly
We have
exhibit.
Style Weekly. We always have stuff. Just come, take a walk with us, visit, do stuff.
The Valentine is one of the organizations that CultureWorks is partnering with during October to host a Pay What You Will event for us, a Pay What You Will walking tour of the art murals of Jackson Ward. And I know that you all have a lot of different walking tours that you offer in addition to your exhibits. So yeah, everyone, go out. When's the last time you went to the Valentine? Come out and see them. Thanks, everyone. And again, this chat will be on YouTube in the coming days if you missed anything and want to go back and see anything. And thank you, Bill, for your time.
Absolutely. Great being here.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Take care.